Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the 2014 Hans Jenny Memorial Lecture. I'm Ron Amundsen. I'm chair of the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management here at Berkeley. And before we begin, I just want to make a few announcements. First, after Chris Mooney's lecture this evening, we'll have a period of questions and answers. There's two mics, one on either side of the room. So please step up, get in line for the Q&A, and speak clearly and slowly in the mic because we're filming the event this evening and we'll post it on our website later this spring. The second thing I want to remind you all about is to take your cell phone out and make sure it's turned off before we begin. So thank you very much for attending to that. I want to say a little bit about Hans Jenny, about the person that this lecture is named after. Hans Jenny was one of the world's great thinkers in soil and ecosystem science. His ideas not only guide a modern generation of earth and ecosystem scientists, but they are part of the high school curriculum concerning soils in the California school system. In the course of this lecture series, we've enjoyed talks by some of the most eminent ecologists, earth scientists, and documentary filmmakers in the United States. But one of the great characteristics of Hans Jenny was his personality was his frequent remark to his colleagues that we need to discuss ideas more, especially how to promote the idea of science in the public eye. Jenny's wife, Jean, was an irrepressible partner in Hans's post-retirement research, and one of her favorite comments to many of us was, "You need to make science sexy." Jean and Hans spent much of their 25 years of retirement using science to advocate for the preservation of natural spaces and for the importance of science in public policy and decision-making. Thus, we are delighted to have Chris Mooney join us tonight to deliver his presentation, The Science of Why We Don't Believe in Science. Chris's lecture is part of our special 20th anniversary seminar series for our department, one exploring one of the themes of the Anthropocene. In this series, we're attempting to put humans in a geological perspective, considering the challenge of biodiversity and sustainability issues that face us this century and the complex challenges we face in discussing and communicating possible solutions. It's on this point, discussing and communicating the challenges ahead and the possible solutions, that Chris can offer us unique insight this evening. Chris Mooney is an award-winning author and science and political journalist. He's a contributing writer at Mother Jones and a host of the Climate Desk Live, and he's also the author of 4 books, including Unscientific America and the New York Times best-selling book, The Republican War on Science. His most recent book is called The Republican Brain, The Science of Why They Deny Science and Reality. Chris's work has been featured regularly by the national media, including appearances on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, The Colbert Report, MSNBC, and NPR's Fresh Air with Terry Gross. His articles have appeared in numerous publications, have been selected for the Best American Science and Nature Writing Awards in 2006 and Best Science Writing Award in 2010. His 10-year blog, The Intersection, was a recipient of Scientific American's 2005 Science and Technology Web Award. Chris is an experienced trainer of scientists in the art of communication. We look forward to his comments tonight and would like to invite you to a special follow-up discussion with Chris tomorrow morning, which will focus on the intersection of science and communication. That discussion will take place tomorrow at 9 a.m. in 132 Mulford Hall. And so now, without further delay, please join me in welcoming Chris Mooney.
Thank you. Thanks. It's great to be here, and I want to thank Ron and the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management for inviting me, and all of you for listening. And let me just start with a tip of the hat to where I'm coming from. I cover science, and especially climate science, for Climate Desk, and this is who we are. We're a media consortium of these publications dedicated to covering climate change, sharing content, and enlarging the total footprint of the coverage that we do. We also have a podcast, and this is my baby right now, something that I really love. I don't know, do any of you listen to Inquiring Minds? Have any listeners out there? Couple. Okay, you need to listen. Okay, so tune in. It's on iTunes. It's one of the top science podcasts. We cover an even broader array of sciencey, policy relevant stuff, including what I'm going to talk about, the science of science denial. But one of our recent guests, I want to just quote him to kick us off. We had Neil deGrasse Tyson on the show, and this is one of the things that he said. All those who think that they can cherry pick science simply don't understand how science works. And yet, boy, do they do it. Boy, do they cherry pick science. Well, why on earth does this happen? And that's what I'm going to I've been researching the subject for 3 or 4 years now, so I'm going to sort of synthesize almost all of it for you tonight. So that's the talk, the science of why we don't believe in science. And what I'm going to tell you about is this amazingly frustrating thing, human nature, and how, unfortunately, even though there are wonderful things about it, it can lead to some bad responses when it comes to dealing with scientific information, and how really, in the end, denying science is a fundamentally emotional process. And it is not really that different from being in denial about the fact that your marriage is ending, or your kid is a bully, or those cigarettes you smoke are going to kill you, okay? It's actually closely related to that kind of denial. So that's what I'm going to tell you, but before getting into it, why on earth should you listen to me? I mean, what do I know about this? I'm not a scientist. I'm a writer, and I write about science. Basically, I write, and there was a time when maybe I could have written about anything because I just wanted to see my name and my words out there. But a certain person had a huge influence on me and pushing me in this direction and having me end up here. A certain person communicated scientific information to me in a way that was unforgettable and in a way that stuck. And I'm talking about my late grandfather, Gerald Cole, an Arizona State University limnologist. Who knows what limnology is? Probably some people here do. Freshwater ecosystems, right? They're little tiny microscopic bugs that are named after him. And he was this, you probably know this kind of person. He was an irascible scientist character, utterly rational, utterly intolerant of nonsense and superstition. And he brought us up that way. And he thought, this was the 80s, right? So he felt that scientific thinking and the whole ethos of science was a great refutation to everything having anything to do with Ronald Reagan. And the young earth creationists, boy, did he hate the creationists. And if there was one thing that he cared about, it was evolution and interpreting everything in life through that lens. And it went so far that he created an invisible friend that he talked to on our behalf. And this friend was named Chuck, which was short for Chuck Darwin. So we grew up with Chuck Darwin. We got to know him. And as a result, I imbibed the scientific worldview at a really young age. And it was my grandfather's example that made me want to be the kind of writer who acts as a connector between the world of science that he understood so well and the worlds of politics and society that clearly were not getting the message in the 80s and still aren't in many ways. So Darwin didn't call it evolution, at least not at first. He called it descent with modification. And so you might say that I'm descended with modification from my grandfather. So I became a writer, and I wrote about science, and following this anti-creationist impulse, I wrote about the maddening and often dysfunctional disconnect between science and society. And this started in 2005 with this book I did, The Republican War on Science. And I like to disclose whenever I show this image that I wasn't trying to echo the cover image of another popular book that was out at the same time. You know, it just happened, right? So the argument of my book, the other one had a subtle argument too, but my argument was that under the administration of George W. Bush, these were the Bush days, scientific knowledge and the people producing it, they were both under attack on an array of issues within the government itself. So on global warming, on stem cells, on evolution, and on anything having to do with sex, science was in trouble. And being a writer, I had to weave a story. I had to explain why. Why is this happening, and why is it happening now? So I had to come up with what you might call a causal narrative to explain all this meddling and interference with good information. And so the story I told was the kind of story that journalists always tell, a political story, a story that happened on the surface of politics. And so what does that mean? It meant that I was explaining political behavior, in this case the behavior of the Bush administration, based upon who the administration was trying to please. What interest groups was it beholden to? Who were the constituents? And how were they getting what they wanted from this president that they had helped elect? So I said, well, look, it's modern conservatism. What are the interest groups? Okay, we got the religious right. What do they not like about science? So that's easy. Okay, so that explains that. And then we have the corporate interest groups, corporate America. You know, they want less regulation. What do they not like about science? Any science that promotes regulation. So that covers all the environmental issues. So we have this perfect storm of science abuse and denial because of the modern conservative movement and how it gets itself elected. That was basically the kind of narrative, classic political story to tell. The reason I'm giving this talk is that I no longer see that account as sufficient. The problem is that it ignores the psychology behind the behavior, the role of the brain, the self, the emotions, personalities. And over time, I began to suspect that a psychological and emotional explanation was needed here as well, not to completely displace the political one, but to complement it and to enrich it. And I'm aware, I've been made aware, that this approach can be a little controversial. Maybe it's no surprise that people don't like to get their political views psychoanalyzed. They think that they came to their ideas rationally. They think that they had a choice, and they think that they make sense. The trouble is, they don't. And there's now a large body of scientific research suggesting that, in a nutshell, political ideology is sort of the precise opposite of rationality, polar opposite. And so really, I'm just reporting on that research. So I guess I would say that if you don't like what I'm saying, don't blame me, blame the scientists. You know, they're the ones who are producing this stuff, and boy, they're producing a lot of it, and all I'm doing is telling you what they're telling me. So that's what's going on. So here's what first made me realize that you needed a psychological approach in order to understand this phenomenon of science denial. I learned about a fascinating 2008, that was the year, poll from Pew, documenting something that I called in my last book the smart idiot effect. Okay? So what we got here is the relationship in 2008, and it's not really very different now, between your political party affiliation, your views on whether humans are causing global warming, in other words, your views on reality, and your level of education. Okay? So what we got here is we got college grads, and we got not college grads. We got Republican, Independent, Democrat, Republican, Independent, Democrat. Okay, so look at that. What you're seeing is the fact that if you are a Republican, then the higher your level of education, okay, the college grads, the less likely you are to accept scientific reality, which is that global warming is caused by humans. And yet, if you're a Democrat or an Independent, precisely the opposite is the case. So this flies totally in the face of what scientists would expect and want to hear, which is that education, it ought to decrease bias, right? It does not work that way. Politics is the opposite of rationality. Please remember that. I want to now show you another example of this phenomenon, and I don't know if you knew that by coming out tonight you were going to have to do math. But you are, so get ready, and I'm looking for the right answer from the room. So this is, I'm going to show you a study that I reported on back in September of 2013. And everybody was talking about it, so you might have seen this already. Because what it did was it showed another smart idiot effect. In other words, the people who know more are dumber, are more wrong. And this was even worse than people's views about science. It was people's views about what the right answer was to a math problem in which there was only one right answer. Okay? So here was the experiment, and I'm going to have to read it to you. We're going to take a little time because, believe me, this is going to be illuminating. So they set up this sort of complicated word problem, if you will. They tell you that medical researchers have developed a new cream for treating skin rashes. Now, the new treatments often work, but sometimes they make the rashes worse. Even when the treatments don't work, sometimes the rashes get better on their own, sometimes they get worse on their own, so you got to do statistics. As a result, it's necessary to test any new treatment in an experiment to see whether it makes the skin condition of those who use it better or worse than if they had not used it. Okay, there's a little bit more explanation, but basically we then get a table of results. Okay, we got patients who did use the skin cream, the number for whom the rash got better, the number for whom the rash got worse. We got patients who did not use the skin cream, the number for whom the rash got better, and the number for whom the rash got worse. Now your job is to tell me, are you going to put this stuff on your body? Okay, are you going to use this skin cream? Now most Americans get this wrong. Okay, the majority of people in this study, first of all, get this wrong. So what's the right answer and why? Come on. This is Berkeley. Come on, you know this. Let me see a hand. Yes, brave man. Tell me. Why?
Because it's more likely to make the rash worse.
And how do we know?
Because the number of people who didn't use the skin cream, 5 times as many people got better.
Yes. So you have to compute a ratio, right? This is what most people don't do. Okay? So if you compute the ratio, then you see that 1 in 3 get worse, roughly, from using it. 1 in 5 get worse from not using it, so stay away from this ridiculous skin cream. Okay, that's just the beginning. Most people get that wrong. Then the study gets interesting, okay? Because it turns out there's 4 conditions in this study, okay? There's one condition in which the right answer is that the skin cream works. One condition that you just saw where it doesn't work. And then 2 conditions where the numbers are exactly the same, but this is now a math problem about handguns, okay? And in one of those conditions, what we're doing is now we have cities, okay, not people, and we have cities that passed a concealed carry ban, so no concealed handguns. And in one of the conditions, most of the cities, crime decreases, so the ban works. And in one of the conditions, crime doesn't decrease most of the time under the ban, or not as well as doing nothing, so the ban doesn't work. Okay, so now what happens when you add something that is so super political? Here are the results. First on the top, and this is from Dan Kahan at Yale. On the top is just the, first of all, how they do in the skin cream condition. On the bottom is how they do in the handgun condition. And now we've broken it out by politics, right? So we got blue, liberal Democrat. We got red, conservative Republican. And as you see, as people get better at numeracy is also in the study, just how good are you at mathematical reasoning. Okay, a bunch of statistics and kind of mathematical reasoning questions. As people get better on that, they get better at the skin cream question. Okay, so people in this room, you're probably higher than average on numeracy. You're probably going to do better on that skin cream question than average. But as soon as it's the other question, people's numeracy increases. Suddenly, as they're good at mathematical reasoning, they're only right when it supports their politics. You see that? Liberal Democrats, they do awesome when they're really good at numbers and they're in the condition where it supports their political ideology, which is that the concealed carry ban works. Okay? But they do terrible if it turns out that, taking guns off the street doesn't work, just in the context of this fake little thing. Okay? And conservative Republicans are the opposite. They do great in the scenario, although notably not as great. But they do great in the scenario where it supports their ideology, and really poor in the scenario where it doesn't. So you look at a result like that, and your response is basically this. Like what is up, Homo sapiens? Like, how can you be this way? As it turns out, there really is a way to explain this. There is a science of why we deny science. There are facts about why we deny facts. And in fact, this science is something that's really familiar to us and really easy to understand, because we all know from our personal lives, from our relationships, and from our families how hard it is to get someone to change their mind, even when they're completely wrong, and even when you give them all the reasons why they're wrong. Does it work? No. No, it doesn't work. And we know from many, many great works of literature, this is a scene from Great Expectations, the silent film, that there are so many characters who fall for self-delusion and rationalization, like Pip from Great Expectations. And what Charles Dickens grasped about people in a literary way, we are confirming now based upon psychology and neuroscience. And what this leads to is a theory called motivated reasoning, which demonstrates that we don't reason about politics much different than we reason about matters in our personal lives. at least if we have a strong commitment or investment in the topic. If we don't care, we can be rational. If we really care, motivated reasoning. The process of motivated reasoning, to understand how it works, you need to understand three basic things about the brain and how it works. First of all, and the implications of this go way beyond motivated reasoning, the vast majority of what your brain does, you are not aware of, okay? It is unconscious activity. The conscious part that is you, that you think is you anyway, is really a really small slice of all the activity. Now, one of the things, that's the first point. The second point is one of the things you don't know is happening is that you are having rapid emotional or affective responses to all the stimuli that you encounter. Okay? The ideas, the images, the people. Okay? They're being tagged. They're being tagged emotionally. And that's sort of how the brain is, in effect, organizing them. And the third thing is that these taggings guide the retrieval of memory. So the thoughts, the associations, the arguments, the other emotions that are associated with the topic come up through this process. And this all happens before you're aware that it's even happening. So what this means is that by the time you are conscious, let's say, you hear an argument on Fox, okay? They're saying something on Fox. By the time you're conscious and you're about to destroy that idiocy, you think you're being rational. You think you're being logical. You think you're reasoning like a scientist, but you're not. You're acting like what? You're acting like a lawyer. When we do become conscious of reasoning, we've already been sent down the garden path by emotion, and we are retrieving from memory the arguments and the associations to support what we already think. And then we proceed to, quote, reason in a biased way. And then there are all the biases that have been documented, the confirmation bias, the disconfirmation bias, and on and on and on. Goalpost shifting. There's so many of them. We're not really reasoning, we're rationalizing, we're defending our case. And the case is part of who we are. In fact, the case is a physical part of the brain. So motivations drive reasoning, and to understand the denial of science, all you have to do then is identify the motivations, all right? And then just let it run its course, and you will have denial. So let's shift now, and we're going to spend some time identifying all of the motivations that prompt motivated reasoning and other, let's say, less than desirable kinds of reasoning. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to unpack 4, these are not the only ones, but 4 really important psychological and emotional factors that have been shown in published research to be pretty clearly implicated in people denying various kinds of science and that drive motivated reasoning. Here they are. 1, conspiratorial thinking. 2, distrust. 3, the need for cognitive closure, and I'll tell you more about what that is. And 4, individualism. We'll spend a lot of time on that because that's a lot of fun. Let's start with conspiracies. So here's something that amazed me when I first learned it. Did you know that the people who think the moon landings were staged by Hollywood or that Lee Harvey Oswald had help, they are more likely to be climate change deniers? They are more likely to be HIV/AIDS deniers? This was a finding of Stephen Lewandowski, a psychologist, in a recent paper in Psychological Science. You can see the citation there. What he showed is there's this surprising element in the rejection of science. It's not the whole cause of it, but it's an important element that a lot of people didn't know was there, which is a conspiratorial element. And it's not even necessarily ideological. It's just that these are the people that believe in all the conspiracies that are also in the science denier crowd. And the conspiracy beliefs travel together. So as Lewandowski told me when I had him on the podcast, if a person believes in one conspiracy theory, they're likely to believe in others. There's a statistical association. So people who think that MI5 killed Diana, they probably also think that Lee Harvey Oswald didn't act by himself when he killed JFK. So who's a conspiracy theorist? It's a certain kind of person. They have their distinct personality and dispositional factors associated with it, and guess what? You'll be shocked to know that one of them is paranoia, okay? But another one, a little more subtle, is sense of disgruntlement, being unhappy with how society is treating you. And when you think about global warming denial, what is it if not a conspiracy theory? It posits a global cabal of scientists, all coordinated to pull the wool over your eyes, to mislead you. And they've got to be super coordinated because they're all over the world, okay? And they're all editing this gigantic report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. They must be really, really synchronized. They must really have all drunk the Kool-Aid and gotten the secret messages, right? And if you know anything about science, you know that this is completely inconceivable, right? Because if there's anything that they are, it's disorganized, okay? Right? So, but nevertheless, this is the conspiracy theory. So you will also not be surprised to learn that the global warming deniers did not like being called conspiracy theorists very much. And you can now read all over the web about the fallout from this paper, but I will just tell you that it has a fascinating ending because Lewandowski wrote a second paper analyzing the response to the first paper, right? And he found that, well, what do you think? The conspiracy theorists, seriously, Google this. There's much that you can read. The ironic thing is that Lewandowski himself said that this is a small factor in climate denial and in science denial. This is not like the biggest factor. And in fact, the last factor I'm going to talk about is the one that he pointed out is the most important factor. This is just associated. It's driving some of it. It isn't the biggest one. And interestingly, he's done another paper more recently that I wrote about, got a lot of attention, where he looked at different science denial beliefs and how much they were associated with being a conspiracy theorist. And it turns out that for climate change, it's a real association, but it's small. Where is it big? The vaccine people, okay? They're the conspiracy theorists. They're the ones where this is the correlation, the size of the correlation. And the correlation is above 0.4 for the conspiracy theorists. Now, that's serious stuff in social science. You know, for the climate change deniers, it's really pretty small. It's not making a big impact. But for the people who think that the government is involved, colluding with corporations to suppress knowledge about how dangerous the vaccine supply is, yeah, they're conspiracy theorists. And it's important to note, and I'll just leave it on this point, that this is not a left-right thing. This aspect of science denial is not a left-right thing. It's a conspiracy thing. It can fuel denial on both sides of the spectrum. Okay, let's go on to the next really important factor, distrust. Now, this is very emotional and too often overlooked, but it's really important in how the political right is responding to science. I don't think it's a big factor on the left, but I think it's a big factor on the right. So there was a paper, really important paper by Gordon Goshot 2 years ago in American Sociological Review, and I am happy to say that he set out to test Mooney, parentheses 2005. I love when I get talked about like as a citation. He was testing whether the Republican war on science was true. And so he wanted to see, well, do conservatives not like science? And so he went to the General Social Survey, which is this great repository of population-level data on all kinds of questions that people are asked consistently over time. And one of them is their trust in institutions question. So how much do you trust various institutions in U.S. society? They get asked it every couple of years. And there's a list of institutions. So it turns out people think the military, really very trustworthy. People think Congress is slime, okay? They don't trust Congress. They think we journalists, we're slime. They don't trust us. They tend to trust scientists. They tend to trust doctors. Okay, this won't come as a surprise to you. What Lewandowski did was he broke out the responses on trust in science by left-right ideology and also moderate. So the conservatives are the red, liberals are the blue, moderates are the black. And what he shows is this steady march downward among the conservatives since '74. Okay? You know, when the culture wars started, basically, the conservatives and their trust in science just went down and down and down. It isn't just science as a whole. I think it's probably certain fields in particular. We know that when it comes to environmental science, boy, do they not trust you. Okay, so here's data from Lawrence Hamilton of the Carsey Institute in New Hampshire. He asked this survey question in 2011. Would you say that you trust, don't trust, or are unsure about scientists as a source of information for environmental issues. Okay, and he got a big partisan difference in the responses. So with the Democrats, 67% said they trust scientists as a source of information on environmental issues. Only 6% said they really distrust, gave that answer. Okay, what kind of number are we going to get for Republicans? What are you going to see? Come on, give me some guesses. This is going to be fun. How many? 15? 25, 33? No, you're too hard on them. So 42% trust, but 22% distrust. Okay, so it's a substantial difference on both the trust and the distrust. It adds up, I think, to a pretty big difference. So what this means is that you hear information, and if it's coming from someone you don't trust, you don't have to think about it. You just dismiss it. It can happen automatically. In fact, it turns out that we think that's what's happening with Fox News and science. There was an interesting study in the Public Understanding of Science, and what they said is that, okay, we know that if you watch Fox a lot, you're more likely to not believe that global warming is true, not believe that it's caused by humans. We know that, okay? Fox is like a risk factor, okay? But why? And what they show is that one of the mechanisms by which this occurs is that it is sowing distrust in scientists. And the paper explains that trust is a shortcut. They call it a heuristic. That's academic speak for a shortcut. And what it does, it lets you make up your mind without knowing anything. Okay, it's so super easy. Because I don't trust those people, so I can immediately discard it. And that's what conservatives are doing. Okay? They don't even have to necessarily get into too much complicated motivated reasoning, although they can, especially if they're smart, especially if they know a lot of math. But they can also just dismiss it because they don't trust it. Now, where does the distrust come from? Well, I think it goes a long way back. I don't think it's just Fox. I don't think it's Rush Limbaugh. I actually think conservatives know, in some sense, what they're talking about and what they don't trust. We all know we are in the halls of academe. This is an extraordinarily liberal place. Okay? I'm saying this in Berkeley, but I say it in other college towns because it's always true. All right, let me just give you some stats. Members of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, 6% Republican. College professors, 15% Republican. Okay? There's a quotation from Neil Gross, a sociologist who studies the politics of academia. More so than ever before, the highly educated comprise a key constituency for American liberalism and the Democratic Party, one that may have surpassed a crucial threshold level in size. 15% of liberals today have advanced degrees, far more than the percent of Republicans who have advanced degrees. So conservatives know this. They're not dumb. They know that academia is not a very hospitable place to them. And they feel, therefore, about academia, which includes science, the way they feel about Hollywood. That's the place where the liberals are, okay? Dismiss it, distrust it. So that's a very, very important factor. Now, let's go on to the third factor, the psychology of closure, or closed-mindedness. And this is also really important on the right, especially important on the Christian right, and very wrapped up in the issue of evolution denial. Okay? So there's a great psychologist at the University of Maryland called Ari Kruglansky. And he pioneered the study of this trait called the need for cognitive closure. And what it means, and once I describe it, you're going to know exactly what it is. This is the need to have a definitive answer about something so you can stop having to think about it and worry about it. Okay? So you have no more ambiguity, so that you have certainty, and certainty is oh so comforting. Okay? And this trait is associated with a certain kind of behavior which he calls seizing and freezing. Okay? I need closure, so I seize on the information that gives me closure. Okay? Whatever it is, I got to find it, and I'm going to engage in a real information search until I find it. But then I'm going to freeze, and I don't want any more information. And if you attack my closure, boy, am I going to argue back and defend my closure. Okay? You fight back and you defend the beliefs that gave you closure as if you are defending yourself. Now, we all have this need for closure sometimes in our life. Certain situations we really want an answer. Okay? How did I do? Did I pass the test? All right? But what he shows is that some people are dispositionally more likely to need closure all the time. Okay? Some people need it sometimes, some people need it all the time. Who are these people? Well, there's certain things about them. Okay, anti-evolutionists, they tend to be higher on need for closure. Fundamentalist religious believers tend to be higher on the need for closure. Okay, so this is playing a gigantic role in science denial. In one amazing study that just shows the close relationship between closure and religion, a sort of natural experiment occurred where people were studying religious belief in New Zealand, and then an earthquake struck. Okay, and they could actually separate out in their sample the people who had been affected by the earthquake and the people who hadn't been affected by the earthquake. The people affected by the quake showed an upswing in religious belief. Okay? But only if they had been directly affected by the quake. Now, there are other studies showing that if you prime people to think about death, think about dying, it increases their religiosity, it decreases their belief in evolution. Okay? It's not just death, it is randomness and disorder. They have the same effect. So in one study, research participants were asked to think of a situation in which they lacked control. Okay? They were then asked to, quote, provide 3 reasons supporting the notion that the future is uncontrollable. What did they do? They showed a marked decline in their acceptance of evolution and increased support for intelligent design. Okay? So evolution is closely tied up with this need for certainty. And people feel that evolution means disorder, means chaos, means lack of meaning, and they're just not ready for it. So that is driving a massive amount of science denial as well. Now, since we picked on the religious believers, it's important to now turn and also put on the couch the atheists. Just for balance, okay? It's only fair. There are psychological factors, actually, that predispose people to not believe, predispose you to be an atheist, a skeptic, and they're not all necessarily good news. They don't make the atheist seem incredibly righteous. So one of these factors is that, and this has been studied by a great psychologist in the University of British Columbia named Aaron Zion. Atheists tend to be less good at mentalizing. And what mentalizing is a fancy word for the ability to put yourself in the mind of another, okay? To infer and read the minds of people around you to figure out how they're feeling, what their mental state is. So it turns out there's an association between religiosity and mentalizing. Mentalizing helps you connect in your community, but the surprise is that it also makes you more likely to be religious. Because apparently religious believers relate personally to a God whose mind they feel that they can understand. Almost like that God is a friend or a neighbor. So Zion says that when people enter into a relationship with a supernatural agent, they are engaging their mentalizing tendencies. Okay? So that's one of the psychological precursors for not being religious. And the other one, and this will surprise you less, is super enjoyment of effortful thinking. Okay? And this is Zion again. This is an amazing experiment where they just randomize whether you see one of 2 statues, one of 2 classical statues, and one of them is a thinking pose, and one of them is an athletic pose. Okay? So it's like the nerds versus jocks experiment. Just having looked at the thinker, people report less religious belief afterwards. Okay? They just looked at it. They didn't, they weren't asked any question. So atheism is sort of this, I like this strenuous cognition. There's a lot of, they did 5 experiments to show that. The thinker one was only 1. I like to check my impulses and question them and question and question and question and think it through. The atheist would do really well on the skin cream question. Okay? But don't expect them to feel your pain. Okay? So the final cause of science denial, and this is a big one, is something called individualism, but you might know it more popularly as libertarianism. And it's a really, really big factor. The single biggest factor in anti-environmental science sentiment that I think there is. And what individualism is this deep-seated view about how society ought to operate. And the core idea is that the best society is one where everybody either gets ahead or falls behind based upon their own merits. And that's fair. And what isn't fair, and what's actually immoral, is for a government to step in and disrupt that relationship and tilt the scales so that some people get advantaged in some way and some people don't. So what's fair is that if you fail, you deserved it. Okay? And what's not fair is to get involved and to actually tip the scales. Now, like other ideologies, liberalism, conservatism, religious, not religious, Libertarianism has a psychology associated with it. One thing that's fascinating that makes it different from the others is that it also has a gender associated with it. It is male, okay? According to a recent Pew study, libertarians are 67% male. And according to the next study that I'm going to show you, it's actually higher than that. So I've never seen a study that didn't suggest that libertarians tend towards being male. So what makes them tick? And this actually is going to show you what makes all ideology tick. And that in turn drives all kinds of science denial. So this is the work of Jonathan Haidt, and people probably know him because he's gotten a lot of attention for his research on the moral underpinnings of political belief. And what he shows is that there are these 6 moral foundations, he calls them, deep-seated moral emotions that we all feel, but to varying extents. And the variation in the extent to which we feel the emotions is what drives us to different political poles. And also, when we're in the throes of these emotions, these are, again, automatic emotional processes prior to conscious thought, they can drive us into a state of motivated reasoning. And of course, Haidt has written a lot about motivated reasoning as well. So look at what's so interesting is that liberals are the white bars, conservatives are the solid bars, libertarians are the stripes. And the moral foundations of harm and fairness are really the areas that make liberals liberals. Okay? So that means that they feel very morally aroused and emotional when they see something innocent being harmed. Okay? They see children being harmed by environmental pollution, let's say. Or when they see some kind of injustice. Okay? You know, people walking away with lots of money while the economy crashes. All right? Conservatives have got this thing that liberals cannot possibly understand, which is that they feel strong emotions about in-group, okay, being loyal to your tribe and people like you. And liberals are like, what? You know? Following authority, liberals are like, we hate authority, smash it, right? And then purity, which is basically like being disturbed by lots of things having to do with sex. And liberals and libertarians are like, what? You know? Okay, and so liberals are like libertarians in a lot of ways. But then you get this liberty thing. And when it comes to lifestyle liberty, stay out of my bedroom, liberals are much more like libertarians. But conservatives and libertarians have this allegiance, and it's what holds them all together, which is that they believe in economic liberty. Not stay out of my bedroom, but stay out of my economy. Stay out of my marketplace. Stop tilting the scales so that there's winners and losers. And they're closely allied on that. And that is the moral foundation that drives all the denial of environmental science, because all the denial of environmental science is tagged with this idea that they want to regulate. They want to change the way the economy would work if you didn't mess with it, and that's not fair. Not only is it not fair, it's actually morally wrong, okay? And so their responses to environmental science, especially climate science, are deeply emotional and automatic and are emerging from this moral foundation. And the moral foundation drives the motivated reasoning. And one thing I didn't say about libertarians, but you already know, is that they are often extremely smart, okay? So they've got this moral foundation, they have a lot of knowledge, and they can argue endlessly with you about how climate science is wrong, okay? So, you know, do a radio show. Go on the radio, talk about global warming, wait for the callers, okay? Male libertarians will tell you why you're wrong, okay? I've done it so many times. So sure enough, when it comes to these issues, you actually have a classic case of the smart idiot effect. Okay, this is Dan Kahan's research again, and he divides up the ideologies a little differently, but basically you've got individualists. Okay, he calls them hierarchical individualists, but they're the individualists. And you've got the egalitarian communitarians, that's basically the liberals. So as the scientific literacy increases, he's giving people a test to see how good you are at understanding basic science. Okay? How much do you think global warming poses a threat? The better the individualists get at science, the more wrong they will be about global warming. That's the relationship. It's always the relationship. Okay? That's how it works. Okay, so I've shown you a number of psychological and emotional factors that are shown in published research to underlie resistance to science. And you'll note that nowhere have I done what journalists so often do, which is to point the finger at companies like ExxonMobil and Koch Industries and say, this is all about big money funding denial, okay? Because that's a totally simplistic way of looking at it, okay? Because guess what? Yeah, the Koch brothers, they fund things they believe in, and they're libertarians, okay? But that's not a good explanation. What you have to do is understand the ideology and where the ideology comes from, because it's no shock to find that people fund the things that they believe in, because liberals do too, okay? So claiming that attacks on science are bought and paid for is too simple a storyline. We need to understand this phenomenon in its human dimensions. And understanding it in its human dimensions is the only thing that will ultimately help us actually combat it and grapple with it, okay? So what can you do, given everything that I've told you, and this is the part where you're like, okay, I just want to bang my head endlessly against the wall, Chris. I mean, you've made me incredibly depressed, okay? You've given me no release. Now I will. Because what you've heard, simply put, it ought to change your behavior. It ought to drastically change how you approach the act of persuasion and presenting evidence and knowledge. And first of all, okay, the last thing you should do if you want to persuade someone is to run out and try to explain environmental science to a libertarian. Okay, there's so many other people you could be trying to persuade. From a communication standpoint, especially one that's good at science and math, from a communication standpoint, the most important upshot of the research is that resistance is coming from a particular set of people with a particular set of emotions and motivations that are extremely important to them and who they are. But by definition, there's a vast middle always of people that are not those people. All right? So by knowing where the resistance is coming from, you can know where there's less resistance. And so the folks at Yale do the 6 Americas of global warming. Here they are. You'll note that the doubtful and then the dismissive, the really hardcore deniers, they're a small percentage overall. And if you really want to get people to listen to you, why would you target them? I mean, there's so many other people. There's the concerned, there's the cautious, there's the disengaged. The problem is that they don't know as much, okay? The dismissive think they know everything. They think they have every reason why it's a hoax. It's not a good place to start your communications. So you want to go to the middle ground. And the other thing that you want to do is it's the same with ideology, is you want to, knowing that there are all of these moral foundations out there, and knowing that liberals generally respond to only 2 of them, harm and fairness, then you should say, aha, we've probably been making all of our arguments based on harm and fairness for a long time. And we probably haven't ever been touching all these other emotions that are out there. And it's not just the conservatives that are feeling them. Everyone's feeling them to some extent. And a lot of people are feeling them to a greater extent than liberals are, including moderates. So it might be the only thing, first of all, the only thing that will give you a snowball's chance of actually convincing the extremes is to speak to their emotions. Okay? So it's important to master the kinds of emotional arguments and moral arguments that they make. But it's also the case that there might be all kinds of new and relatively untried ways of communicating about science and, say, the environment by drawing on moral foundations that people aren't at all used to. And there's actually research suggesting that using the foundation of disgust is very good for talking to conservatives about the environment. Okay? So talking about environmental degradation, defilement, and the disgusting nature of pollution, okay, which is not something that you usually hear, actually is a very good idea for conservatives because those words have this incredible visceral meaning, okay? They're feeling strongly in a way that liberals wouldn't necessarily be ready to appreciate. So this new research points to very specific strategies that are likely to work better in communicating than the old, bang your head against the wall approach that we've been trying until now, and the old approach of trying to tell people the facts, noticing it doesn't work, but then just keep doing it because you don't know what else to do, okay? And just as this research tells you better ways to communicate and who you're likely to be able to reach, it also tells you something else really crucial, which is that when you're trying to convince somebody, you have to focus not on the ideas, okay? Not on the facts. Because those are sort of a smokescreen for the identity. You have to focus on the person. And you have to realize that this stuff is deeply, deeply, deeply personal. And that point is made very strongly by studies showing that what actually works to de-bias people and to make them not as bad deniers of facts about reality, is something very different than telling them information. What works is affirming their sense of self and their self-worth. Okay? So there's a variety of studies on what is called self-affirmation, where there's an experiment. It's going to test how biased you are and how unwilling you are to change your beliefs. But before you do it, some of the participants are asked to remember a situation in which they felt good about themselves. Or they're asked to think about a value that really characterizes who they are and write a short essay about a time when that value was really important to them and made them feel good about themselves. Okay? And then they ask them questions about things that go against their beliefs, and they get less resistance. So in one case, a researcher named Brendan Nyhan did this for these people who really just hate Obama, and he was asking questions about the economy. And these are people who believe, against all evidence, that a billion, not a billion, it's much bigger than that, a gigantic, I don't even know how big it was, stimulus bill passed in the wake of the economic depression didn't create any jobs. They actually believed that you could throw this much money into the economy and not create jobs. Well, they were more likely to agree that Obama had created jobs after the self-affirmation exercise than the people who had not gone through the self-affirmation exercise. So some people, when they first learn about all of this psychology research, the first reaction is to get really cynical and to think, it's hopeless, we'll never convince anybody, Homo sapiens is an extremely messed up species, I throw in the towel. But I would think about it a little differently. My view is this: we have had wildly unrealistic expectations about how persuasion works for a long time. Blame the Enlightenment, blame something, okay? And it's only now, finally, we're understanding the reality of how it actually works. We're only now getting grounded. We were not grounded before. So now, for the first time, we have reasons to actually think, well-founded reasons to think that progress could be made. Before, there were no well-founded reasons because we didn't even understand what communication was about. So it's not a bad time to be communicating and persuading. It's a good time if you want to actually do it based on an understanding of what you're dealing with and what you're up against. So in conclusion, I want to leave you with some words of eternal wisdom from a profound philosopher, Yoda. Yoda said, "You must unlearn what you have learned." And when it comes to the denial of science and any other facts about the world and reaching people who disagree with you, that is the situation in which we're all in. Thank you.